In the year 1944, the Atlantic Ocean stretched vast and unforgiving, its waves concealing both commerce and death. Beneath the rolling swells lurked steel predators, German U-boats, that for years had terrorized Allied shipping lanes. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign not fought in grand fleets arrayed for decisive battle, but in shadows, in depth charges, in coded messages sent through the static of the night. And it was in this desperate contest, as the Allies slowly tightened their grip, that one of the most dramatic encounters of the war unfolded. A German crew, hardened by duty yet battered by fear, would find themselves not only defeated, but astonished by the treatment they received from the very enemy they had been taught to despise. The war at sea was brutal. The German U-boat fleet, pride of Admiral Karl Dönitz, had once been the sharp spearpoint of Nazi strategy. In the early years, they prowled the Atlantic in wolf packs, striking convoys under cover of darkness. In 1940 and 1941, merchant ships erupted in flames across the horizon, their crews cast into icy waters. The U-boat arm was so successful that Britain teetered on the brink of strangulation. Winston Churchill admitted later that the U-boat menace was the only thing that truly kept him awake at night. To Germany, the submarine campaign was a chance to achieve victory without direct invasion. To Britain, it was survival itself. But the tides of war shifted. By late 1942 and 1943, Allied science and industry tilted the balance. Radar grew sharper, sonar more precise, and escort carriers extended the reach of Allied patrols. Long-range aircraft scoured the ocean, hunting submarines that once surfaced with impunity. Convoys bristled with destroyers and corvettes, their depth charges exploding with merciless persistence. The hunters had become the hunted. Losses among German crews rose catastrophically. Young men climbing into the cramped hulls of U-boats knew they were sealing themselves inside steel coffins. The average patrol carried not only rations and torpedoes, but resignation to death. U-505, a Type YXC submarine launched in 1941, was no stranger to this grim reality. She had endured depth-charge barrages that buckled her hull, limped back to port, scarred and leaking, and claimed a handful of Allied victims in earlier patrols. By 1944, command had passed to Oberleutnant Harold Lange. His crew, 59 souls, survived on foul air and stale bread, haunted by stories of comrades never returning from the depths. Each dive was a gamble, each patrol a roll of fate's dice. They fought the sea as much as the enemy, enduring crushing boredom punctuated by moments of terror. On June 4, 1944, fate rolled again. Off the coast of West Africa, U-505 prowled in search of prey. The morning was deceptively calm, the horizon a blur of blue and heat. Yet danger lurked unseen. The destroyer escort USS Chatelain, part of Task Group 22.3 under Captain Admiral Gallery, had picked up a sonar contact. Gallery's group, built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, was a hunter-killer formation, its sole purpose to track and destroy submarines. Orders crackled across radios, depth charges rolled into position, and the hunt began. Inside U-505, alarms rang shrill as the first explosions hammered the hull. The submarine shuddered violently, men thrown against bulkheads, gauges shattered, pipes split under pressure. The air grew thick with smoke and oil, water seeping through seams. Panic threatened to overwhelm discipline. The noise was deafening, the pressure unrelenting. More charges detonated, each blast a hammer blow against their fragile sanctuary. Lange, weighing the lives of his men against the certainty of annihilation, made the dreadful decision: surface the boat and abandon ship. When U-505 broke the surface, she was a wounded beast. Shells from the Chatelain splashed nearby, tracer fire lanced the sky. German sailors tumbled out of hatches, flinging themselves into the sea. Some clutched life preservers, others had nothing but desperation. They expected machine gun fire, expected to be left to drown. Instead, American sailors maneuvered boats toward them, hauling them shivering and terrified from the Atlantic. For many, it was their first taste of mercy since the war began. On the bridge of the Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery faced a decision of his own. Naval doctrine dictated the submarine be sunk outright, denying the enemy any chance of recovery. But Gallery had long dreamed of something bolder, capturing a U-boat intact. Against all risk, he ordered a boarding party. Small craft sped across the waves, and American sailors clambered onto U-505's deck. The submarine threatened to sink beneath them. Scuttling charges set by her crew ticked in the shadows. Inside, water poured through ruptured pipes. Torpedoes loomed in their tubes. Fuel leaked dangerously. Yet the boarders pressed on, fighting to stabilize systems, close valves, and pump out the flooding. They wrestled with controls in an alien language, deciphering dials and levers with seconds to spare. By miracle and sheer grit, they succeeded. U-505, though battered and gasping, remained afloat. For the first time since the War of 1812, the U.S. Navy had seized an enemy warship at sea. For the German crew, now huddled prisoners, disbelief reigned. They had been raised on propaganda that painted Americans as ruthless barbarians. Many expected execution, others humiliation. Instead, they were handed blankets, water, and cigarettes. Some broke down in tears, their bodies shaking from exhaustion and fear. To be given kindness after weeks of tension, hunger, and the claustrophobic stink of the submarine was almost too much to comprehend. When brought before Captain Gallery, they braced for scorn. But the Admiral's words stunned them. "You fought bravely. You were doing your duty, just as my men were doing theirs. Now you are prisoners of war, and you will be treated as such." For the Germans, that moment changed everything. They had prepared themselves for hatred, but what they received was dignity. Gallery made it clear to his men that the Germans were to be respected, not reviled. And so it was. Instead of taunts, they were met with calm efficiency. Instead of brutality, they were treated with professionalism. This was not weakness, it was strength of a different kind. Meanwhile, U-505 was stabilized, though barely. The captured submarine was towed across the Atlantic, her battered hull creaking under strain. It was a perilous voyage. Storms threatened, and the risk of sinking remained constant. Yet the Americans persevered, knowing the prize they carried was beyond calculation. When intelligence officers swarmed over her, they found a treasure trove. Enigma codebooks, charts, and materials lay within, items of incalculable value to the Allied war effort. The capture was so significant that it had to be kept secret at all costs. To Berlin, U-505 was reported lost with all hands. The German command, unaware of her capture, assumed the crew had perished beneath the sea, another casualty in the mounting toll of the Battle of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in the United States, the real crew was quietly hidden away. They were kept in special camps, isolated from other prisoners of war, to ensure the secret never leaked. Their families back home mourned them as dead. Letters written by mothers, wives, and children were never answered, piling up in silence. For the men of U-505, it was as though they had vanished from the face of the earth, and yet their treatment remained humane. In the Texas sun, they played soccer on dusty fields, studied English, and tended small gardens behind barbed wire. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive. For many, this unexpected life was a strange gift, a second chance in a war that had offered so little mercy. Some even came to reflect that it was their enemy who had shown them more humanity than the regime they had served. For Captain Gallery, the capture was the culmination of daring vision. He had long argued that it was possible, even necessary, to seize a U-boat intact. Few believed him, dismissing the idea as reckless fantasy. But Gallery had trained his men with that possibility in mind. When the chance finally came, they acted with precision and bravery. His gamble changed the course of the war at sea. With U-505 in Allied hands, codebreakers could anticipate German movements with greater accuracy. Convoys could be rerouted, ambushes avoided, and lives saved. The submarine that had once hunted became a tool of the hunted, turned against its makers. Yet beyond the intelligence victory lay something harder to measure: the moral victory. In choosing mercy over cruelty, Gallery demonstrated that the rules of civilization need not be abandoned even in war's darkest hours. His treatment of the German crew was not just kindness, it was a statement of values. That strength was not only the capacity to destroy, but the will to act with humanity. It was a lesson the German prisoners would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Years later, many of those same men spoke of their astonishment at how they had been treated. For some, it was the first moment they began to question the lies they had been fed. The image of Americans as monsters shattered when they were given cigarettes instead of bullets, blankets instead of beatings. For others, it planted a seed of doubt in the Nazi ideology that had driven them to war. Perhaps, they thought, the enemy was not as inhuman as they had been told. Perhaps the war itself was built on illusions. Back in Chicago, U-505 eventually came to rest in the Museum of Science and Industry, preserved as a monument to this extraordinary encounter. Tourists walk her cramped passageways, duck through hatches, and marvel at the claustrophobic conditions endured by her crew. Guides tell the story not only of her capture, but of what followed. The story of humanity revealed in the most unlikely of places. Children press their hands against the steel, imagining the thunder of depth charges and the fear of drowning in darkness. And they learn that even in war, choices matter. The capture of U-505 reminds us that history is not only about weapons and battles, but about decisions. Decisions made by individuals in moments of crisis. Harold Lang's choice to surface and save his crew. Admiral Gallery's choice to risk everything to capture the submarine. His later choice to treat his prisoners with dignity, when cruelty would have been easier. These choices echo louder than the explosions of depth charges. They speak to what humanity is capable of, even in times of savagery. The men of U-505 never forgot the day they encountered an American admiral who defied their expectations. They had braced themselves for scorn and death, only to be met with respect. That memory, carried back across the ocean after the war, lingered long after the guns fell silent. It was a reminder that the face of the enemy is not always the face of hate. Sometimes it is the face of honor. The war would grind on for another year after the capture of U-505, but for the men directly involved, the experience left a mark that time could not erase. The Americans who stormed the submarine carried with them the pride of having done something unprecedented, a daring feat against one of the most feared weapons of the sea. For them, it was proof of training, courage, and trust in their commander. They had shown the world that even in the chaos of battle, discipline and ingenuity could win the day. For the German crew, the memory was more complicated. They had lost their vessel, their pride as submariners wounded by capture, but they had also gained their lives. In the stillness of the prisoner camps, many reflected on that. Had they gone down with their boat, as so many comrades had, their war would have ended in cold oblivion. Instead, they had been granted time to think, to question, and ultimately to live. For some, that was the first crack in the armor of the ideology they had served. It is easy to forget that by 1944, German U-boat crews were among the most isolated and embattled forces in the war. Once hailed as the vanguard of Hitler's might, by then they were little more than prey, stalked by Allied aircraft and hunter-killer groups across the Atlantic. Death rates among U-boat crews were staggering, among the highest of any branch of service in the Second World War. Most submariners did not expect to survive. To be captured, then, was an anomaly, a fate so rare that it seemed almost miraculous. That rarity gave U-505's crew a unique story, one that would outlast the Reich, that had sent them into the ocean's depths. For the United States, the victory was kept secret for a long time. The intelligence haul was too precious to risk exposure. Only a handful of men knew the full truth of what had been won that day. In hushed rooms, codebreakers pored over the charts and machines, their fingers tracing the lines of German thought. Every page captured from U-505 might save a ship. Every symbol cracked, another life preserved. The stakes were invisible, but immense. Out on the convoys, sailors never knew why the wolf packs seemed suddenly less deadly, why their odds of survival rose. They did not need to know. The work done in secret ensured that supplies reached Europe, that armies could march, and that the Allied cause was sustained. But for Gallery, there was no secrecy in his conviction about how the Germans should be treated. He spoke openly of it, not as sentiment, but as policy. "We gain nothing by cruelty," he once remarked, "but we can lose much by it." His men understood, and they followed his example. Their behavior toward the prisoners became part of the unwritten story of U-505's capture. It was a demonstration that professionalism in war was more than marksmanship or seamanship. It was also the conduct that defined what they fought for. After the war, when the prisoners of U-505 were finally released and returned home, they faced a world transformed. Germany lay in ruins, its cities shattered, its regime destroyed. Many of them returned to families who had long believed them dead. The shock of reunion was bittersweet. Children had grown without fathers, wives had mourned as widows, and in many cases, lives had moved on. Yet the men carried back something that set them apart from others: the knowledge of how they had been treated by their captors. For some, that knowledge planted seeds of reconciliation in the soil of defeat. They could testify that the enemy they had been taught to despise had shown them respect. In the long, painful years of rebuilding, such testimonies mattered. They were reminders that bridges could be built, that the victors had not been driven solely by vengeance. The submarine itself, U-505, became a silent witness to this history. When eventually brought to Chicago and placed in the museum, it was more than a relic of technology. It was a stage on which the drama of mercy had been played out. Visitors who step aboard her today see the cramped bunks, the dials and levers, the torpedo tubes. They hear the guides speak of her capture, of the daring boarding party, and of the intelligence windfall. But underlying it all is another message, quieter but no less vital: the reminder of how enemies treated one another when the battle was done. There is a moment in history when steel and fire give way to human choice, when a commander looks at his enemy and decides whether to destroy or to preserve, whether to hate or to respect. The story of U-505 is filled with the clash of machines and the thunder of weapons, but its legacy lies in that moment of choice. The German crew expected one fate and were given another. That gift of life, wrapped in dignity, would endure longer than any torpedo's impact. The ocean has swallowed countless ships and men, their names forgotten in the deep. But U-505 was spared, and because of that, so too were her crew. In their survival and their treatment lies a lesson, one that resonates far beyond the Atlantic. Wars are fought by nations, but humanity is carried in the hands of individuals. Admiral Gallery, by his actions, proved that humanity need not drown in the tide of conflict. And for the German crew who faced him, that truth became the most unexpected discovery of all. In the quiet years after the war, when the guns fell silent and the oceans returned to their ancient rhythms, the story of U-505 settled into memory. But for those who had lived it, the echoes never faded. The Americans remembered the fear of boarding a hostile submarine, the smell of diesel and smoke, the creaking hull that might have exploded at any moment. They remembered the look in the Germans' eyes, defiance mixed with despair, as they surrendered their steel beast. For the Germans, the memory was just as vivid. The blinding sun as they emerged on deck, the deafening roar of American guns, and then the shock of mercy instead of wrath. Many of the crew, years later, would tell their children and grandchildren of that moment. They would describe how they expected death, only to be greeted with blankets. How they had been told Americans were savage, only to find themselves treated with honor. In a world scarred by bitterness, these recollections became private testaments that reconciliation was possible. Some even traveled to America after the war, standing aboard their old submarine in Chicago, running their hands along the steel, and remembering the day their lives had changed forever. The legacy of U-505 is not confined to military textbooks or museum displays. It is a reminder that in the darkest hours of conflict, choices of compassion can echo louder than violence. It was not inevitable that the Americans would board her successfully, nor was it inevitable that the Germans would survive. At every step, it could have gone another way. A single explosion might have obliterated the boat. A single decision of cruelty could have ended lives. But those paths were not taken. Instead, history turned on a different axis, one defined by daring, by discipline, and by humanity. The Battle of the Atlantic was one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. Thousands of sailors died in freezing waters, entire convoys were torn apart, and the outcome of the war itself hung in the balance. Yet within that vast and merciless struggle, there emerged moments like this one. Moments when the tide of war revealed the resilience of the human spirit. The capture of U-505 was a tactical triumph, yes, but also a moral one. It showed that even amid carnage, men could still act with honor. For the United States Navy, the feat remains legendary. The capture of an enemy warship on the high seas was something out of another age, an echo of the days of privateers and daring raids. To pull it off in the modern era was almost unthinkable. For historians, it remains a testament to preparation meeting opportunity, to vision backed by courage. And for those who walk the decks of U-505 today, it is a tangible link to the moment when that unthinkable feat became real. The German crew had never expected to be treated the way they were. They had braced for humiliation and pain, and instead they were met with a strange, almost unsettling humanity. That shock left an impression far deeper than hatred ever could. And in that impression lies the lesson of this story, that even when nations clash, even when violence seems all-consuming, there remains space for honor, respect, and mercy. The story of U-505 is ultimately a story about people, about the men who fought beneath the waves, about the men who risked everything to seize their vessel, and about one American admiral who chose to define victory not only by what was won, but by how the enemy was treated afterward. In his decision lay a truth that transcends war, that our humanity is never lost unless we choose to surrender it. And so, as the years pass and the veterans fade into memory, U-505 still speaks. She speaks not only of torpedoes and depth charges, but of choices and consequences, of mercy in the midst of war. Her steel hull is silent now, but the story she carries continues to echo across generations. For those who listen, it offers both a warning and a hope, a warning of the destruction war can bring, and a hope that even in that destruction, humanity can endure. If you found yourself drawn into this story, remember that history is filled with such moments, moments where human courage and compassion intertwine. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told, and we invite you to stay with us as we uncover them. Subscribe to the channel, join us for future documentaries, and let the past remind us of what it means to be human.